Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving into some truly fascinating and definitely controversial territory. We're breaking down a book by Ryuho Okawa called The Truth Behind World Conflicts. Now, our goal here isn't to take sides, validate, or debunk anything. We're just going to neutrally unpack the exact geopolitical and spiritual arguments presented in this text. And what makes this book such a unique cultural artifact is its, well, incredibly rare approach. It actually attempts to dissect intense, modern global conflicts through the lens of a channeled spiritual medium.
The whole premise of the material we're unpacking today hinges on a really bold claim. The book presents what the author categorizes as a spiritual message, basically a channeled interview with the spirit of the Prophet Muhammad. The stated goal here? To bypass all our modern political rhetoric and uncover the true intentions of Islam, digging into the deep-seated spiritual roots of why major world religions clash. So whether you look at this as religious theology, geopolitical commentary, or just a fascinating piece of alternative media, there is a whole lot to unpack.
To make sense of all this, we're going to follow the book's structure. The original text covers 7 distinct chapters, but for today's explainer, we've grouped those into 6 core themes. 1. Muhammad's current thoughts. 2. Views on war and peace. 3. Terrorism and extremist factions. 4. The global international outlook. 5. Spiritual exchange with Japan. And 6. Advice for happy science.
Let's jump right into Section 1, Muhammad's current thoughts.
So the first question we have to ask is, why is the spirit of Muhammad choosing to speak out right now, in the modern era? Well, the interviewer in the book asks this exactly, trying to figure out how Islam should be perceived by outsiders today. And the text points out a massive modern cognitive dissonance. You see, the word Islam actually shares etymological roots with salam, which literally translates to peace. So the channeled entity is supposedly speaking out to directly address this huge gap, the gap between a foundational concept of peace and the incredibly violent global conflicts that many outsiders associate with the faith today.
Moving on to Section 2, Views on War and Peace.
Okay, so if the root of the religion is peace, how does the text reconcile that with a history that's often seen as really militant? Well, the channeled entity explains this by pointing out a very unique historical position. Unlike other major religious founders, think Jesus or Buddha, who were mainly spiritual teachers totally detached from physical statecraft, Muhammad had a dual role. He was a religious messenger, sure, but he was also a military hero and a literal state builder. The argument the book makes is that you just can't separate the pure spiritual teachings from the brutal, practical realities of building and defending a physical nation in what was a deeply hostile historical environment.
Because I was also a military hero, Muslims do not fear war. According to the book, this historical duality, this embedded bravery, is exactly why the faith appears outwardly belligerent to the rest of the world. But, and this is absolutely crucial, the channeled entity strongly insists that the original intent was never to unjustly persecute anyone or start unprovoked wars of aggression. Instead, it was fundamentally about self-defense. It was about ensuring the literal survival of the early believers when they were completely surrounded by enemies.
That brings us to Section 3, Terrorism and Extremist Factions.
Now, transitioning from historical battles to modern warfare, the original text dives into a deeply sensitive topic. It asks the channeled spirit a very heavy question, point blank. Is suicide terrorism actually permissible or encouraged by the teachings? And the entity responds quite clearly that no, modern suicide terrorism is not explicitly written into the original doctrine. The text frames the concept of jihad simply as a holy war meant solely to protect the faith when it's under an existential threat. So it draws a really sharp theological line between a defensive war and a blanket endorsement of modern terror tactics that indiscriminately target civilians.
Fascinatingly, the text then makes a direct comparison to the Japanese kamikaze forces of World War II. It's a pretty unexpected cross-cultural analogy, right? The channeled spirit argues that dying in such a violent manner doesn't automatically guarantee you a spot in heaven. Instead, the book describes the spiritual mechanism where a person's afterlife destination depends entirely on their individual self-awareness and their true inner intent. So if they are genuinely sacrificing themselves out of a pure desire to protect their homeland from destruction, the spiritual result is vastly different than if they're just acting out of pure, unadulterated hatred for an enemy. Furthermore, the book offers a very specific, nuanced characterization of well-known extremist groups, explaining how they view themselves. It describes the Taliban not just as special military operatives, but fundamentally as strict theological schools, or madrasas, heavily focused on rigid, puritanical doctrine and internal societal control. On the flip side, it characterizes Al-Qaeda as pure fundamentalists who are focused outward. The text asserts that, from their own internal perspective,
These groups absolutely do not see themselves as villains. Rather, they view themselves as righteous, reactionary forces born entirely out of necessary resistance against what they perceive as aggressive, unchecked Western imperialism. Which leads right into Section 4, the Global International Outlook.
This whole theme of resistance ties directly into how the broader Islamic world views the current geopolitical landscape. According to the interview, there's this pervasive existential fear of being totally dismantled or culturally subjugated by Western, historically Christian nations. And this isn't just political. The book frames it as a deeply spiritual crisis. The text highlights a deep-seated resistance to what it calls U.S. imperialism, aggressively pushing Western values and economic systems into the Middle East. Plus, it notes that, from an Arab standpoint, events like the founding of Israel are viewed not just as political disputes, but as inherently unfair historical impositions forced upon them by Western powers, which permanently fuels ongoing regional tension.
Now, for Section 5, Spiritual Exchange with Japan.
So given all this intense global friction, where does a nation like Japan fit into the picture? Well, consider this staggering statistic. Out of Japan's massive population of over 120 million people, there are historically only about 50,000 practicing Muslims. Because of this huge cultural and demographic distance, the author introduces this concept of isolated spiritual ecosystems. The premise here is that the Japanese Shinto and Buddhist spiritual realms and the Islamic spiritual realms have almost zero historical overlap. Therefore, spiritual crossover, meaning the literal reincarnation of souls moving back and forth between these two distinct cultures, is incredibly rare. The text basically argues they're operating on two entirely different spiritual frequencies.
And finally, Section 6, Advice for Happy Science.
Because of this profound lack of spiritual connection, the final part of the source material outlines direct advice for the author's own Japanese religious organization, Happy Science. And the strategy proposed is highly ambitious. It starts with finding a shared foundation. You see, Islam's Quran is based on the vocal transmission of divine words to a prophet, a concept that's fundamentally similar to Happy Science's own core practice of channeling spiritual messages. Once that bridge of communication is open, the next step involves reaching out to educate globally minded, economically stable Muslims who already understand Western and Japanese cultures. From there, the ultimate goal is huge. By acting as a cultural and spiritual bridge, this modern Japanese religion hopes to gently aid in the modernization of ancient Islamic practices, aiming to ease the friction with the Western world.
Ultimately, the core underlying message from this entire spiritual interview is a plea for understanding. The channeled spirit says, "I want the world to know that Islam is not a teaching of the devil." The source material insists that despite the sheer volume of violence dominating our global news cycles, the foundational intent of the religion is not inherently evil. The entity is essentially asking the world to take a step back from viewing these massive cultural clashes purely in black and white good versus evil terms, and instead to seek a deeper, more nuanced theological empathy. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. Whether or not you buy into the spiritual and channeled nature of these claims, the text does leave us with a really compelling question to ponder. Is understanding the deepest, unvarnished religious motivations, how people fundamentally view their own faith and their perceived enemies, the actual missing key to finally resolving world conflicts? Thank you so much for joining us as we explored this material. We really hope it gives you a whole new framework to think about these complex global issues.